I'm Rob Dodson, developer advocate at Google's. I work on web components, I work on accessibility. Today, I just want to give an update on where web components are at, heading forward to 2017, and also where Polymer is at. So last year, we saw a lot of really good progress in the web component space. I think probably the biggest and most awesome news was that Safari shipped Shadow DOM in 2016, which was pretty awesome. So that means the most important aspect of that is that it means that now on all the sort of major mobile browsers, we've got Shadow DOM there natively, which means we can do some different things with the way we polyfill Shadow DOM moving forward for other browsers. We can, in the past, we've done a lot of stuff to kind of cater to the lower powered mobile devices. So now we can do some different things with Shadow DOM moving forward, which will make it a little bit easier to polyfill and hopefully make interoping with like other libraries and frameworks a bit easier. We still have a lot of work to do in 2017. This is kind of like the current support matrix for web components right now. And I'll walk through these kind of piece by piece. So template has that shipped everywhere. Basically, you can use the template element today. That's all good. HTML imports have definitely had a rough go of things. I think what we'll see in 2017 is this idea is probably going to go back to the drawing board. I think a lot of people who've worked on the import standard want to try and see if they can rework this so that we come up with a system that's built on top of the ES module loading system rather than building like a separate parallel system. So I think we'll probably see maybe some new ideas pop up in this space in 2017. But HTML imports, it's not critical for the rest of web components. So for instance, we can still do things like use custom elements. And custom elements had a really good year in 2016. We saw a lot of progress from Firefox and Safari, both of which have been in active development. So for Firefox, if you actually want to track their progress on custom elements, I got this link here, bit.ly/ff-custom elements. They have kind of like an Uber bug where they're tracking all the things that roll up into custom elements support. And I think as early as or as recently as this week, they were doing some updates on that bug. The really cool news though is that I believe it was earlier this week, Safari announced that they're going to be shipping custom elements in Safari 10.1. So I got a link here to the Safari release notes for that. So when 10.1 lands, that'll be awesome. We'll have native custom elements on 3 of the big browsers out there. I've been talking with the Edge team, and they've told me that they're also really gung-ho about doing custom elements and Shadow DOM, but they had to sort of choose in 2016 because they were a little resource constrained. They had to choose whether to do service worker first or web components, and they really wanted to get service worker out the door. So they did a lot of good work in that space, and I'm hoping that in 2017 we'll start to see maybe some web components progress out of the Edge team. And finally on Shadow DOM, so yeah, it's shipping in Chrome and Opera, shipping in Safari now. We also have Firefox doing active development there. So it's looking good, but again, we still have a lot more work in 2017. The other thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be shipping updated polyfills for the V1 specs. So the individual polyfills are going to be maintained at github.com/webcomponents. They're already up there right now. I think we're still sort of tinkering with the custom elements polyfill a little bit, but you can go ahead and you can use it. I've been using it a lot in projects. The one thing that we will be doing is creating bundles of the polyfills. So for instance, if you only want custom elements and the bits that roll up into Shadow DOM, maybe you don't want HTML imports, we'll have bundles for the different sort of permutations. So that way it can be a little bit easier for people to load like a group of polyfills all at once. That's kind of where we are with web components. And then the next thing I want to talk about is Polymer 2. So Polymer 2 is a major version revision of Polymer, kind of filing off some of the rough edges that we had in Polymer 1.0. And mainly, though, it's about migrating over to the V1 web component specs. So because there are some API breaking changes that come along with that migration, we wanted to be good Simber citizens and do a major version revision. But it's important, I think, for anyone who's using Polymer to understand that this is not like a full-blown rewrite or anything like that. And I'll show some code that sort of shows the delta between Polymer 1 and Polymer 2 a little bit. The main thing is, we wanted to migrate to the new specs, and so we, had to do a major version revision because of that. we've been very focused on backwards compatibility as we've been doing this, and making sure that if you have a bunch of Polymer stuff today, it's really easy for you to transition to Polymer 2. Probably the biggest change is that we're finally moving over to ES2015. I know for basically everybody else that's presenting today, it's like, whatever, that's like what they've been doing from the get-go. On the Polymer side of things, we really held off on requiring any sort of ES2015 code, mainly because we didn't want people picking up Polymer to have to also pick up a bunch of like build tools and build process along the way. This is something that I actually personally argued with the team with a bunch. I was like, we should go all in on all this like cool new stuff. It's what developers are using. It's awesome. But I kind of came around to their perspective after spending a lot of time with developers who use Polymer. And there's a lot of folks who use Polymer, and it's like it's their first web library or their first web framework. It's their first time building an application or something like that. And so not overwhelming them with too many tools or too much build process, I think has actually been really good for that audience. So I'm kind of glad we went in that direction. But we now have a lot of, or basically all the modern browsers have good ES2015 support, so it's time for us to move over. So this is an example of a Polymer 2 element. The thing to note here is if you've done Polymer 1 before, this should look really familiar. The primary difference is now you're building a class that's extending from a Polymer element. And instead of the old Polymer constructor where you passed a big config block into it, you've now just you sort of define your elements as kind of like static properties on that class. But if you actually look at that config getter, you'll see you still have a properties object that you pass in. You still have observers and things like that. So much of the API is the same. It's maybe the syntax has changed slightly because we're building classes now, but it shouldn't feel that unfamiliar if you're used to Polymer 1. The other big thing we've been doing is a lot of improvements in the data binding system. So again, filing off rough edges and stuff. Some of those changes, the first is that when you do a bunch of changes now, we're going to batch those together and make sure that the effects are run in deterministic order. In the past, Polymer's data binding system could be a little difficult to reason about, like the sequence in which things happen. So that's being improved. Also, if you're observing multiple properties now, we are going to run your observer anytime any of those properties changes, even if one of those properties is undefined. This was actually not the case in Polymer 1, which we purposefully did as a feature. If a property was undefined, we wouldn't run your observer. That actually tripped up a lot of folks, though. They thought that was a bug. And so after dealing with a lot of issues on this, we've decided, we'll just switch it. So now anytime a property changes, even if something in there that you're observing is undefined, we'll go ahead and we'll run your observer, and now you just need to put a guard inside of that observer. And lastly, we're sort of changing the way that we dirty check properties, objects and arrays to make it easier to work with libraries like Flux and Redux and any of the other approaches around sort of the unidirectional data flow space where you're kind of passing these big state objects in. We want to make sure that in old Polymer 1.0, we would do some reference checking when you pass in a new object. And if you had changed like a sub-property of that object, our data binding system would not pick that up. And that will not be the case in Polymer 2. In Polymer 2, it'll be easier to change sub-properties, change children in an array, and the data binding system should just do the right thing. We're also getting rid of like leaky abstractions, things like Polymer DOM. So Polymer DOM was an API that we had to support our shady DOM shim, our kind of like lightweight shadow DOM emulation layer. And you kind of basically had to tell the system that you were about to touch the DOM using the Polymer DOM API. So if you're about to call a query selector or anything like that, you had to wrap it in Polymer DOM. This was all mainly for the benefit of mobile browsers to make shadow DOM as performant as possible on them. Now that mobile browsers have native support for shadow DOM, we can get rid of this API. We can make using shadow DOM a little bit more kind of transparent to the user. The nice thing is that getting rid of this API is also going to make it a lot easier for Polymer elements to interoperate with other frameworks and libraries, which I think is awesome. And as I mentioned before, we're also going to be providing a compatibility layer. So if you're building Polymer 1.0 stuff today, it's really easy to transition to Polymer 2 with like little or no changes. So we're referring to these as like hybrid elements. And I'll give you an example of one. So this is a Polymer 1.0 element that I've created here. The thing to note is that I'm importing polymer.html up there at the top. and I'm calling the Polymer constructor. And then I'm using a content element up there in my div, which is the old like web components v0 approach to doing Shadow DOM. In Polymer 2.0, the only real change that you would need to make to this element is you would need to replace content with slot. That is part of the Shadow DOM v1 spec. But otherwise, everything else here will continue to work in Polymer 2.0. And we went back and we made sure that Polymer 1.7 understands the slot API as well. And so you can have elements that look exactly like your Polymer 1 elements today. In fact, you can even start writing Polymer 1.7 elements using slot today. And then when Polymer 2 comes out, those elements will be future compatible. There are some things that we will be removing, like we'll be getting rid of behaviors and replacing those with like class mixins if you're building Polymer 2.0 elements. But actually, I asked the team about this last night, and if you build a behavior in a hybrid element, that should be okay in Polymer 2 as well. But when you want to go like full on into a 2.0 element, you'll want to use class mixins instead. Okay, so that's Polymer, or the last bit I want to talk about is really just sort of like some of the tools and resources around Polymer and the web components community. So in 2016, we released Polymer CLI. I feel like 2016 was like the year of CLIs. I think everybody released a CLI. So we released a CLI to make it easier for folks to build and bundle their project for production. We want to keep pushing on the CLI and keep adding features to it. And we also want to continue really encouraging the growth of the web component ecosystem in 2017. So to give you an example of some of the stuff we want to do to Polymer CLI, one of the things is we want to add automatic transpilation for legacy browsers. We don't want people to have to write a big gulp toolchain or anything like that. So when you're running commands like Polymer serve to start your dev server, or Polymer test to run your integration tests, we're just going to be transpiling your JavaScript code on the fly if you're opening this up in IE11 or browser that needs it. Also for Polymer build, this is the underlying library that does all of our sort of bundling and productionizing. We're going to be adding JS compilation to this as well, along with CSS minification, HTML minification. You don't have to use these things. You can absolutely write your own toolchain, but if folks don't want to do a big gulp build process, they can do it through the CLI instead. We're also going to be adding things to the CLI for adding link headers, or sorry, link tags for like prefetch, preload headers and stuff like that, and making sure that can auto-generate your service worker for you as well. So if you actually want to play with the new CLI, you can npm install it. It's Polymer CLI @next. And if you want to give some feedback on it, in our Slack channel, we have a tools room where people can just hop on, the folks working on the tools hang out in there. So by all means, offer any feedback or issues that you have there, or also on GitHub. Keep in mind, though, it's really experimental. So if this thing just explodes, that's kind of to be expected from time to time because it's not actually released yet. The other thing that we're exploring is moving off of Bower and over to Yarn. So I know we're like the only project still using Bower at this point. The reason why we use Bower, which I don't think a lot of people understand, is that web components have a few really unique requirements that Bower caters very well to. So when you're building a custom element, you can only ever have one version of a tag's definition loaded at a time. To kind of give you an analogy, imagine if you're writing an HTML page and there were like two versions of div, like how sort of weird or confusing that would be, or two versions of the input or the button element. That would be like really difficult to work with. So custom elements have that same requirement. You can only load one definition for one custom element version at a time. So you can't have two versions of X button loaded. And Bower kind of like forces this behavior. So when you install conflicting dependencies, Bower makes you resolve that conflict, and it creates a nice flat deduplicated structure. This is something that NPM sort of offers, except for when NPM hits a conflict, I believe it still creates, it sort of silently goes back to nesting structures instead of flattening. And so because we really need this behavior, we work with the Yarn team to make sure that you could install Yarn packages in a flat way, and packages could express that they needed to be installed in a flat way. So this is probably not going to make it for the 2.0 launch, but shortly thereafter, we're going to be probably migrating a lot of our stuff over to Yarn and publishing it up on NPM. And we're also going to make tools available for folks so they can do Bower to Yarn. They can sort of move between the two easily, so they don't have to like go in and manually update all their elements themselves. We'll help them with that migration. The last thing I want to talk about is webcomponents.org. So this is a resource that we put together for a while now. It's been sort of confusing to figure out where to find information about web components. There was customelements.io, there was webcomponents.org, there was the Polymer element catalog. It was all kind of spread all over the place. So we've now consolidated all of those things into this one site, which is sort of a combination effort between folks on the Polymer team and folks out there in the web components community. The cool thing about this site is you can search for an element like emoji rain by my teammate Monica. You can see all of its GitHub stats. You can start yourself through the site. You can read its documentation. If the documentation is formatted in a particular way, it actually makes all the demos live and interactive as well. So you can go down to this emoji raindrops thing, change the number of drops to 50, like in the documentation, and you'll actually see the element update as you do this. You can set it to 50,000 and like blow up your computer. But it's really cool. So you can go through, and there's a lot of elements where you can just go in and you can actually play around with the docs to see how the thing will work. And there's guidance on the site on how to sort of format your docs and your demos so that they work in this way. So that is available if you go to webcomponents.org/publish. And finally, this is the question that everyone asks: when are we releasing Polymer 2? We're hoping to get it out this quarter. But if you follow us on Twitter @Polymer, stay up to date. We'll definitely make our announcement there. And then also, if you have any issues or concerns or anything, please let us know on Twitter as well. We're trying to be better about responding to things over there. Have dedicated folks working on the Twitter feed now. So yeah, be sure to follow us and let us know what you think.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was awesome. Sean Larkin says, wow, impressive changes for Polymer. And I have to say, just seeing what you guys have done in the past year and what you set out to do, it's been really cool to watch. Yeah, I think it's Josip. I don't know how to say his name, but it's he said, since there's some commonalities between Polymer and Angular, since they're both developed at Google, is there any communication between the two teams to share info that might improve the frameworks?
Yeah, so I would say like lately I've been working with the DevRel folks on the Angular team, like Rob Wormald and Stephen Fluin, to figure out how we can better like interoperate, like Polymer elements inside of Angular apps and things like that. I think what we would love to see is folks being able to write web components really in any fashion. It doesn't even have to be Polymer. It could be Skate.js or Xtag or Bosonic. There's other cool web component libraries out there, or vanilla JavaScript, and have those web components just sort of like work anywhere. And so, yeah, I've been talking with Steven and Rob about how we can improve that, basically just like bugging them anytime I'm trying to like fit some pieces together. But my understanding is with Angular 2, this is a lot easier. With Angular 1, which a lot of people try and sort of mash up Angular 1 and Polymer, that is a little bit trickier. With Angular 2, the story is a lot better and a lot easier.
I know there's a few examples out there too. So I think this is actually a really big misconception that people don't think that Polymer is being used in production. But from conversations you and I have had, it's really the larger companies that are actually using web components.
Yeah.
So a lot of people in the feed are just wondering, like, who's actually using it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true. We actually see a lot of like big enterprise companies do it. And I often think it's folks who they have teams on a lot of different stacks, and they need to build a big UI library that is like cohesive. And so they can't really pick any one stack because they'll then be isolating, the other teams that are on that different stack. So a lot of them are interested in web components in general because they're like, build web components, and then hopefully all of our teams will be able to use those elements. So just to name like some folks who are using it, General Electric is using it for like their big design library. Electronic Arts, their website, I believe, is now built in Polymer, the game company. The next iteration of YouTube is built in Polymer. And I think Adidas is interested in it at the moment. We have a list. I think if you just Google like who's using Polymer, I think is what it's called. There's like a GitHub wiki where we try and keep track, but it's like one of those things that always like falls out of date because you forget to update it. But there is a list of like companies on there who are using Polymer.
Does Polymer Builder have an API, like a compiler API? Sean from Webpack said he'd love to provide more Polymer support for our community.
I'm trying to think. The inner workings of Polymer Build are a little bit of a mystery to me. I don't think, well, I would recommend like Sean, check out the GitHub for Polymer build, and I'd be happy to like connect him with the folks that work on that. Because yeah, it'd be I would love it if Webpack had like a transformer or whatever for Polymer build. That'd be great.
Cool, awesome. Well, let's see. I think that is it. Everybody, if you guys have more questions, you can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob_Dodson. Rob, really appreciate you coming out and chatting about that.
Hey there. Do you use Angular? Do you like fun in the sun? And how do you feel about boats? If you're nodding yes, then come join us on NG Cruise to learn more about Angular while on a fabulous Caribbean cruise. Check out ngcruise.com for speaker lineup, workshop details, and to book your spot today.